Few Middle Ages military technologies have captivated historians and aficionados more than the enigmatic incendiary known as Greek fire. Often likened to contemporary flamethrowers, this legendary Byzantine weapon's Arab counterpart, which was flung in small, round pots to hand grenades. To this day, however, the chemical itself and how it was deployed are shrouded in mystery despite intensive research and testing, while many articles and films here on YouTube and elsewhere claim the reverse. Here is everything we know and don't know about the liquid fire of the Middle Ages. To ready an attack on Constantinople, the Umayyad Caliphate established bases along the Mediterranean coast between Syria and the Aegean Sea when it marched west into Byzantine territory in the 670s. To stop that, Constantine IV, the Byzantine emperor, readied his own navy. Some of his galleys possessed a newly invented weapon, a liquid sprayed from pumps or siphons, creating a jet of flame burning everything within its reach, clung to surfaces, and even continued to burn on water. Initially, though, Constantine was unable to prevent the Umayyad assault in spite of these fire ships. They besieged Constantinople, Siege of Constantinople, 674-678. But in winter, 677-678, the emperor at last resolved to equip his fleet for a head-on naval fight. In a conflict about which we know only very little, the Byzantine ships, armed with Greek fire, defeated and routed the Umayyad fleet. While various forms of incendiaries existed already before, this sea battle is the first reported use of Greek fire proper. Today, the name Greek fire commonly refers to this Byzantine ship weapon, but the specialist on medieval military technology, Kelly de Vries, observes that in the primary sources, Greek fire might really refer to three different weapons. Early liquid weapons were pushed out of a nozzle. Later, a solid incendiary most likely derived from gunpowder. Still another liquid weapon was loaded into tiny grenades. While the first two were only used by Byzantines and Muslims, the third was primarily used in Western Europe. However, it first debuted in the 14th century, and it had most likely nothing in common with the Byzantine and Arabic weapons save for the name. Western chroniclers had a tendency to indifferently name everything that had an incendiary impact ignis Graecus, Greek fire. Much of the history of Byzantine Greek fire is obscure, and so are its beginnings. Usually, the innovation is attributed to Kallinikos of Heliopolis, a Byzantine architect and chemist who lived in the 7th century. Most likely, however, he was influenced by earlier incendiary weapons and did not invent it entirely by himself, but with several chemists in Constantinople who had inherited the discoveries of the Alexandrian chemical school. There are two key reasons why we know so little about Greek fire to this day. On one side, it was a weapon so scary that the legends about its devastating effects immediately became legend, and the sources prioritize focusing on the majesty of the weapon over technical detail. On the other hand, the Byzantine emperors simply wished to keep the details of their weapon a state secret. Constantine Porphyrogenitus, for example, warned his son, Romanos II, to keep the formula a secret, and not to prepare this fire but for Christians, and only in the imperial capital. Though this claim obviously can't be taken at face value, it reveals that the Byzantines closely guarded their recipe for Greek fire. And it seems like they were successful. After all, there's actually not much information about it, and neither their enemies nor modern historians have been able to entirely reproduce or reconstruct their weapon. One item that has particularly confused historians and has dominated research on Greek fire was the quest for its lost formula. In the 19th century, the most popular belief was that Greek fire was a combustible liquid containing saltpeter as an oxidant to improve the burning process, similar as in gunpowder. Some years and several hypotheses later, in 1960, a very influential chemical scientist and historian by the name of James Riddick Partington released a history of Greek fire and gunpowder. He argued that Greek fire was made of some sort of natural petroleum, which was maybe even purified by distilling. This would have resulted in a gasoline-like substance that could indeed have performed something like a current flamethrower. However, it is very unclear whether this was technically viable at the time. On the contrary, the usage of naphtha, which is a portion of crude oil, as a fundamental constituent is thought plausible. It was perhaps thickened with resins and maybe blended with other components. According to modern experiments, such a mixture heated at 60 degrees C generates a proper fuel that may indeed be fired from a pump. However, discovering one working method does not prove it is the original formula, and thus debates continue. In the end, there is probably simply not enough data to reconstruct a detailed recipe. The Greek fire, utilized by the Byzantines, is best understood as a full armament system, mounted aboard their galleys, the so-called dromons. The equipment used to shoot the liquid is described by Leo VI of Byzantium as having a siphon, bound in bronze, and placed up front on the prow, as is customary, so that it can project the prepared fire against the enemy. Above this particular siphon, there should be a platform made of boards and walled around by planks. The Viking Ingvar the Far-Traveled purportedly encountered ships armed with the weapon in the 11th century, or at least the Ingvar saga describes a comparable device. Began blowing with smith's bellows at a furnace in which there was fire, and there came from it a great din. There stood also a brass tube, and from it flew considerable fire against one ship, and it burned up in a short time so that all of it became white ashes. Nevertheless, it is unclear how exactly this mechanism operated to this day, even as scholars like John Haldon and Maurice Byrne have brought forward plausible solutions. INF. According to reconstructions, a machine like this could have had a range of up to 15 meters. However, it would have been unsafe to use as the tank in which the liquid was heated became very hot and was prone to explosions. According to the original sources, some ships were outfitted with 2, 3, or even 4 of these complicated machinery. To operate them, multiple experts were needed, as each was only authorized to specialize in one compartment of the weapon to make sure nobody could give away the secrets of the overall creation. Despite this, we know for certain, this form of Greek fire was rarely utilized and primarily in naval wars. For example, Emperor Leo III successfully deployed an imperial fleet to the Cyclades in 727 to burn the fleet of Hellas and the Cyclades, who were revolting against him, and in 941, the Byzantines defeated a Rus fleet attacking across the Black Sea from Kiev. There are at least a dozen INF other situations in which primary sources indicate the employment of Greek fire, but it was all in all still fairly rare. Kelly de Vries theorizes that this might be because of how perilous utilizing the weapon was. Launching an incendiary on a wooden ship was a tremendous risk because fire was one of the largest risks for ships and the sailors aboard. Therefore, Greek fire could only be employed in calm and suitable breezes and currents. Simply rowing around the oceans and blasting out a carpet of fire would very likely backfire. The historians John Pryor and Elizabeth Jeffreys also describe several uses on land, which were very scarce. An illustration of this can be found in the Parangelmata Poliorcetica, a treatise about siege warfare authored by the ancient engineer Heron of Byzantium. A sketch in this book portrays what historians think to be a warrior utilizing a handheld fire weapon, a so-called chirosiphon, to shoot at a wall from a siege tower. Regarding the second type of Greek fire, there are comparable difficulties. In terms of composition, it was probably pretty comparable to the mixture employed in the Byzantine flamethrowers. What differed, however, is how it was weaponized. It was launched by hand or some type of catapult in grenade-like vessels, most of them made of pottery. This sort of weapon was predominantly utilized by the Muslim empires, but also by Byzantine land troops from the mid-10th century. Notably, though, it was far more common than the first form of Greek fire. To give you an idea, among the many documented records, there's one claiming that 20,000 barrels of this combustible liquid were used to fire Cairo in 1168 to prevent the Crusader king Almaric from taking it. Even a better indicator for how widely it was used are the countless remnants of the vessels which have been found all over the Middle East and Western Asia. INF. This weapon came as a surprise to the Crusaders when they first saw it in the 12th century. A highly vivid description is recounted by Jean de Joinville, a French chronicler, in his work Life of St. Louis. He recalls how the Saracens welcomed the Crusaders of the Seventh Crusade with Greek fire, while they were trying to cross the Damietta branch of the Nile to attack Al-Mansura in 1250. When the Crusaders sought to cross the canal by erecting a dam, the Saracens at the other shore brought forward catapults. These machines hurled grenades with Greek fire against the movable shelters, which shielded the workers and lit them aflame. The French chronicler reports, "The tail of flames that trailed behind it was as big as a long spear, and it made such a roar as it came that it seemed like the thunder of heaven. It appeared like a dragon flying through the skies. Such a strong light did it cast, that one could see all across the camp as though it were day, by reason of the vast quantity of fire and the brilliance of the light that it projected." Afterwards, the Crusaders abandoned their plan and retreated. The question arises why Europeans neglected to adopt this technology. The most plausible answer is that they lacked the requisite materials. Petroleum-like materials were quite difficult to get by in Central Europe. So, despite having heard of Greek fire during the Crusades at the latest, they were unable to create it, and certainly not in considerable proportions. Because of this, incendiaries really only became a concern in Central European arsenals after the arrival of gunpowder. All in all, we know relatively little about Greek fire. Although it was clearly not quite the same as hand grenades or flamethrowers, it was unquestionably an extremely effective and fearsome weapon. However, the Byzantines did a wonderful job in keeping their military secret, so that its composition, many specifics of its use, and its origin remain unknown to this day. And to this day, people read probably too much into the stories about its disastrous effects, ignoring the fact that the sources truly only give us sparse and complicated information. Thanks again to War Thunder for supporting this video.